great papers for you today. The title of the session, as you probably know, is Navigating the U.S. Context. And on that note, I was just told that I hadn't heard this news, but I just want to share that apparently a bunch of students were arrested last night at Brooklyn College and in the course of some pro-Palestine protests. And I don't know the details, but I just want to express our support and solidarity for them. Unfortunately, this is just one of many such incidents that we'll be dealing with in the time to come, but it's another reminder of how important our theme at this conference is. Okay, so what I'm going to do is introduce all our speakers now, and then they will proceed in the order of the program. And then after that, and I will make sure they stick to their 15 minutes allotted time so that we have plenty of time for Q&A afterward. Okay? So we have 3 papers. The first one, it has other authors, but our speaker who's here today is presenting on behalf of his co-authors is Wes Williams, who is Director of Policy and Politics at Work4, F-O-U-R, which is a national campaign for the 4-day work week. At Work4, he works with rank-and-file workers, union organizers, and policymakers to fight for shorter work hours and shorter work weeks. Prior to working there, he was a public defender in Richmond, Virginia. That's quite a switch. So anyway, he will be presenting on behalf of himself and John Kruikshack, is that the right pronunciation? Who unfortunately was called into some emergency meeting but works with the Tech Guild at the New York Times. So anyway, but he just to acknowledge. And is the third person also still part of the paper, Angela? No. Oh, okay. Sorry, that's an error then on the program. It's the 2 of them. Okay, so after Wes, we'll hear from Alex Hertel-Fernandez and Alan Yan. And the title of their presentation is Political Engagement and Education Across the U.S. Labor Movement, Evidence from New Match Surveys of Union Members and Leaders. Alex, who's long been a friend of ours and of the school, teaches uptown at the beleaguered Columbia University, where he is Associate Professor of International and Public Affairs and Vice Dean for Curriculum and Instruction. His work focuses on understanding the intersection between politics and markets in the U.S., the politics of policy design, and labor policy. He recently came back to Columbia after serving in the Biden-Harris administration in the Department of Labor and the White House Office of Management and Budget. This is the bio he gave us, and it's a very modest one. He has published extensively on these topics. If you are interested in the details, Google him, and you will find all kinds of great stuff to read. His co-author today, and they're going to share the presentation, is Alan Yan, who's a PhD candidate at Berkeley in the political science department. His interest is in labor unions in American politics, a shared interest, obviously, with Alex. He is focused on how institutional design of unions might constrain their political power. In his earlier work, he's shown that union membership might not liberalize or mobilize members into politics. I think we know that, but he knows why. His current projects are focused on political changes among union officers, the effective right to work laws, and the consequences of the strike wave in 1946, which I believe was the biggest one ever. His work's been published in the American Political Science Review, Hammer, and isn't it Ho, not Hope, it says here, magazine. And, oh no, I'm sorry, that's somebody else's bio, excuse me, in the American Political Science Review. Okay, very good. And finally, our third and final paper will be by Noah Schuster. It's called Deserting the Superstore, Moral Economy Among Rural Retail Workers Today. And Noah is a professor at Sarah Lawrence College up the road and has previously taught at the New School and at Brooklyn College and other parts of CUNY. He's in the economics department at Sarah Lawrence. He teaches about U.S. social movement history, criminal justice, labor history, and New York City politics. At Sarah Lawrence in particular, he's taught labor history and organized a bunch of projects assisting labor organizations around New York. His research is focused on ethnographic studies of retail workers, which is what you're going to hear about today. His first book, which is related to the talk, is coming out later this year from Palgrave Macmillan. It's called, like the paper, Deserting the Superstore. And he's planning some future research around qualitative studies of precarious workers and social movement history. Okay, so you're in for a treat. We have 3 great papers, and let's start. So we'll start with Wes, and like I said, I'll be the fascist timekeeper. Not really fascist.
Great. Thank you all so much for being here. Thank you to CUNY and to Cornell for organizing this. It's been a real joy to be with you all already this week. I want to begin by expressing solidarity for my colleague John, who's not able to be here. He was called into emergency union steward meetings based on some surprise layoff announcements at the Times, so he had to go do the work instead of talking about the work. And also for the students here at CUNY, at SLU, who are fighting for basic protections for students that are organizing against ICE presence on campus. Thank you for your work as well. I now want to start with a disclaimer, which is that I'm going to spend the lion's share of my time talking about the sector that surely all of you hate, which is tech. And even worse, I'm going to begin by talking about Vice President J.D. Vance. So the story begins with this talk that he gave in February. As many of you may know, in February, Vice President Vance went to Europe primarily to express support for far-right authoritarian parties in Europe. But while he was there, he gave this speech at the Artificial Intelligence Action Summit in Paris, mainly to beg European regulators to just stop regulating. But in addition, in an argument that the Times recently praised as forceful, he outlined the administration's pitch for AI and labor. It's the closest thing we've really gotten to a cogent statement of the Trump labor policy, which is to say, closest thing, there were plenty of digressions, including one about the ideological bias present in current AI algorithms that result in things like a Black George Washington. But the paranoia about racial minorities appearing where J.D. Vance might not want them is, I think, illustrative of what their actual vision is for tech and labor, right? Vice President Vance promised that American workers wouldn't suffer from AI job loss because Trump's worker-first approach to immigration would focus on a real clawback of civil rights as a violent immigration crackdown that we have now seen plenty of the fruit of and understand the reality of more and more deeply every day. And also that AI wouldn't result in job loss because surely AI would result in more weapons manufacturing, in the extraction and refinement of the fossil fuels that are needed to power the incredibly resource-intensive AI algorithms that exist. So this is the assuring thing that Vice President Vance was talking about with respect to the American worker. But it doesn't really stop with the administration. One of the things that we've seen en masse in the last few months is that the Silicon Valley wing of Trump's coalition also promises spectacular growth thanks to AI. They're spending all of their time talking about this right now. They give us different answers on whether or where or how tech will take jobs, how AI will remove employment from the sector. But they often are presenting this as a really good thing, right? Bill Gates has talked about the 2-day work week. Jamie Dimon insists that we will all be working less soon. Elon Musk has insisted that a 0-day work week will be coming without any real assertions about what it would look like to live under a 0-day work week under the current administration. And all of these different appeals belie the real issue, which is that there are not and will not be enough good jobs to go around if we continue on the path that we're on. All of the deep institutional fascist problems that we are facing aside, purely economically, we are in dire straits if we trust the current path, and I think everybody in this room knows that. These are not new questions, but they do have a new urgency in this moment. And one of the things that we know is that the way that we respond to this has cascading consequences well beyond the workplace, right? That's why we are all here. The promise of free time has become the basis with which we are abused as workers. there is an assertion that gig work will provide flexibility and the ability to work when we want, totally ignoring the depressingly low wages, the absolute abuses that gig workers face within that system. And this idea of autonomy has become the very thing that keeps us trapped. From top to bottom, this is a system animated by the idea that you can have all of the time that you want, if only you work harder. Your time's already yours, and you just need to devote it to the market, get to be your own boss, and all of the imaginary benefits that come from that will follow. But the economics of the last 50 years or so tell a really different story, which is that we've seen astronomical productivity growth over the last 100 years in the American economy. And we know that basically all of that productivity has been captured by the capital class since the 70s. And from the 40s to the 70s, we see wages tracking significantly with productivity growth, and then that just completely disappears in the Reagan era. Which is to say that the technologies that we see in the Valley haven't actually provided any productivity, any richness to the American worker. Instead, they have mediated productivity for the American worker. They have captured it for themselves, and workers are facing the consequences of that now. Which leads us to, I think, a really interesting and important point of clarity, which is that management doesn't actually want productive technology. The thing that they are after, the thing that has proved out in the history that we look at, is that the actual goal of workplace technology is often control, right? The benefits that we see from something like remote work in terms of, at minimum, the same productivity, but in many cases more, are seen as adversarial to the tech economy because they limit the amount of control that the boss can have over your workday. And that reality is something that we should really remember with the advent of AI. We shouldn't assume that if we experience it as productive assistance in the first place, that that benefit won't be clawed away. So even if AI is generating something good for the American tech worker, and there's plenty of skepticism to be had about that, the belief that that's going to somehow stay in place is one that we should be very skeptical of. The reality that we see now, though, I think the thing that we should conclude from this is that there is a story, a compelling story to be had about the amount of time that the American worker is spending at work. For most workers, the likeliest consequence of AI is not that work is going to go away, that we're going to have 0-day weeks, or that we're going to have 7-day weeks, but instead that the work week itself is going to diminish in the marginal returns, that work is going to get worse for workers, that we're not going to see mass waves of unemployment, at least not at first, but instead the quality of jobs, the wages associated with those jobs are going to erode over time. How we respond to that, I think, is a historical story. If we look at the last 150 years of the labor movement, I think there's a crucial mission component to the way that we're working on this right now. If you go back to Haymarket and then the general strike in 1886, the driving issue of that work was the 8-hour day. The core issue that workers cared about in the post-Reconstruction era was working less. Very, very little of the present narrative is about work time. After Haymarket, you see significant tiny victories. So you see UMW winning it in the 1890s. You see other small shops making progress. But the wholesale change took another 50 years. As we all know, I think the FLSA, which passed in 38, was the thing that really brought the 40-hour work week for most American people. What a lot of people don't know is that the thing that happened right before the FLSA was passed is that Hugo Black, who was the sort of champion in Congress around the actual work hours bill, was initially championing a 30-hour week. So the idea that asking for less work now is a novel problem and one that is sort of cartoonishly foolish is completely betrayed by the actual history, which is that we've been asking for a 30-hour work week for 100 years. That post-40-hour world and workers' passion for it continues on past the sort of compromised solution of the FLSA. The AFL-CIO, then 2 years old in its new merged form, had its very first conference about shorter hours. The core issue for the new federation was working less. The UAW, which at that time was far and away the most powerful union in the US, championed the 30-hour work week well into the post-war period. But I think that the UAW story is a really illustrative one for where we find ourselves now, which is that when they were fighting for shorter hours, Jonathan Cutler, who's done an excellent history on this, talked about the largest local in the UAW being a broad-based movement of African-American militants, along with Irish, Italian, and Polish skilled tradesmen, and a broad array of semi-skilled mass production workers, all of whom supported the demand for 30 hours as a progressive response to the challenge of automation and the threat of technological unemployment. The auto industry at the time was going through exactly the transformation that we see now, the sort of technological erosion of their work, and they saw 30 hours as the solution to that problem. It was only after that that both the CIO and the UAW abandoned that in favor of a labor peace that lasted us well into the modern era. In doing, they sold out the unemployed workers that had recently been laid off. They became a more class-based movement that protected seniority for those largely white workers that had stuck around, and abandoned the sort of solidaristic, robust story that they had been telling to themselves and to their bosses in that era. David Rodinger has done a really good job, I think, of observing exactly what working hours can do. He's called it an explosive demand because of its unique capacity to unify workers along the lines of craft, race, sex, skill, age, and ethnicity. And so that's where we find ourselves today, is in a place where shorter hours is not a part of the primary conversation. There are significant pieces of reporting about the advent of the 4-day work week, but it's often through the guise of a benevolent employer or through the various pilots that have happened in the UK and the US. Rarely is the story about the wide-scale labor demand for a shorter work week. And I think it's really poetic to see that the UAW is who has been the organization to put shorter hours back on the table for American labor. Now that they have undergone the sort of democratic reforms that unions are in need of, they are understanding that shorter hours is a thing that their workers deeply want. Similarly, the AFL-CIO, going through similar reforms, has championed shorter hours in the last 10 years. What that tells us is that shorter hours is not just an important thing for the American worker, but it's actually a way to yield a more solidaristic, more democratic union movement moving forward. The position that we're taking is not that shorter hours is the single answer to the various democratic problems that we face today. The point is that one of the things that we need to identify if we are to see a mass movement of the kind that we've been talking about over the last 48 hours is that we have to have demands that are shared by all of labor. And the thing that we have seen over and over again as we look at the history attached to this issue is that shorter hours is a really good answer to that question. The position that we're taking is not that shorter hours is going to somehow wash away the need for significant anti-racist work, significant class-based solidarity, but shorter hours opens the doors to those other conversations. Without a single demand that unifies all of labor, it is very difficult to find an entry point for those conversations. And what we see in the history is that when unions are at their most democratic, when politics is at its most tumultuous, far and away the biggest answer to what is the cross-shop issue that we can all fight for has been shorter hours. And we think that we are back in that place today, and that shorter hours is one of the answers that we can provide to the movement so that we can begin to generate those other conversations that are needed to fight back against the authoritarianism we are facing today. Thank you.
Thank you. I forgot to mention at the beginning that if you have questions as you hear these talks, there are, where's Casey? Casey is here and will be circulating pieces of paper. You can also just stand up and ask questions at the end, but if you prefer to do it that way while you still remember your question, that's an option. So we're going to move on to Alex and Alan's talk once the PowerPoint is there.
While we're waiting, in the interest of time, I can go ahead and get started and just begin with a quick note of gratitude and an apology. The note of gratitude is for the conference organizers pulling together this amazing community of practitioners, researchers, and other people who care about labor and democracy. And just speaking for myself personally, feels like this kind of community is exactly what we need right now, and I'm finding it very nourishing to be here. The apology is the title is no longer accurate for this paper. You may have heard a reference to a member survey and a leader survey. The leader survey is still in progress, so we're going to be sharing results just from the member survey that Alan and I have been carrying out. And the other thing to say about this work is it's literally hot off the presses in the sense that we have just finished analyzing some of the data, and we're excited to hear from you and the discussant the directions that you think we should be going in this research and the kind of questions that we could be answering. So it's the PDF. Thank you. Great.
Can you make it slideshow instead of, yeah. Great, perfect.
So the starting point for this work is in the social sciences, as folks in this room will be well aware, the large literature that shows that union members have very different political views and behaviors and orientations towards politics than demographically similar non-members. But an important question, and one alluded to in the research by Alan that Ruth mentioned, is how much of this is the effect of unions, how much of this is the effect of coworkers, how much of this is the effect of the kinds of people who join unions. And I think Alan's important work on this topic really suggests that we need to be moving past analysis of union members versus non-union members to really look within the labor movement and understand the internal practices of unions that may shape how their members are oriented towards politics and democracy. And I'll just mention some of the work that I've done in this vein, looking at just one union, the National Education Association, documents really wide variation across locals and the kinds of practices that we might think matter for politics. And so we think that there is much more work to be done documenting these kinds of internal practices and their relationship to politics. And so we undertook a survey of union members that I'll talk more about in a moment to be able to look at both, on the one hand, union members' political views and attitudes, and on the other hand, the structure of internal union practices. And I just wanted to give you a quick preview of the 4 findings that we're going to walk through in the presentation today. The first is we found, perhaps surprisingly, a lack of political mobilization for many union members in 2024. Of course, we'll get into the definition of what political mobilization is and how we may be missing important mobilization that may not be picked up on with this survey item. But about 60% of union members reported that they didn't receive an ask from their local union related to the 2024 election. And we'll show you some variation in that. We also find important variation that will come as no surprise to the folks in this room across unions in members' political ideologies, partisanship, and political views, including on racial conservatism, which we think is important as we think about the orientation of the labor movement towards a multiracial, egalitarian democracy. And we document some important tensions within unions when there are members who feel like their political views are not represented by the union leadership or the other rank and file. We call these members cross-pressured members. Some people are cross-pressured on the left, that is to say they hold views that on average are to the left of where their union is, and some people have right cross-pressured views, that is to say they're more conservative than their other members and leaders. We're going to show you some important asymmetry, though, between right and left cross-pressured members that Alan will talk more about. We find that right cross-pressured members, people who are more to the right of the union, are more likely to report wanting to leave the union than cross-pressured members on the left. And we think there's some interesting implications for exit, voice, and loyalty, to use the Albert Hirschman framework. The last thing that we'll show you is about union socialization, and in particular the steps unions are taking to develop social identities amongst their members, and we're going to show some suggestive correlations that this may matter for how members approach politics. I won't dwell too much on the methodology, but we're happy to talk in the Q&A if folks are interested in more of these details. But we commissioned YouGov, a well-respected online pollster, to interview just over 1,600 union members from across the labor movement. And because of the relatively large sample, we can point out variation in specific unions. We've put at the bottom of the screen there that we have sufficient observations to be able to look across, say, the NEA, SEIU, CWA, AFT, AFSCME, IBT, and UFCW. So I wanted to present some top-line results around political mobilization to start. So we asked union members a standard battery that political scientists often use to see if individuals have been recruited into politics. And this asked union members to reflect, in 2024, were they asked to do any of the following things by their local union? For instance, make a political contribution, share political information with their friends or family members, and so on. And what we find is about a little over 40% of union members have been asked to do one of those things. And there's variation in the frequency of these different asks, ranging from just 10% of folks who were asked to make a campaign contribution to about 21% of union members who were asked to share political mobilization. What we tend to see is clustering. So if you received one political request, you tended to receive other political requests, and then there was a large group who didn't receive any requests from their local union. We also look at variation across unions and find among those unions where we have sufficient respondents to be able to say something about them, that political mobilization ranges from, on the one hand, NEA members, who about 60% of them report at least some political mobilization in the election, to the UFCW, where only less than 20% of members reported political mobilization. So this chart here shows you the percentage of union members by union who said that they were not contacted by their local to do anything in the 2024 election. And you can see that in the middle you have unions like AFT and AFSCME. The last finding that I wanted to share with you is about union social activities and norms. So there's been some really interesting research, including by Laney Newman and Theda Scotchbull, arguing that, again, a finding that won't come as a surprise to folks embedded in the labor movement for a really long time, that if unions want to be effective at recruiting members in politics, that it really helps if the union has fostered a strong union identity amongst their members. And that just as much as the decline of unions unions' abilities to create these social identities may have hampered their ability to recruit members into politics. And I find similar but related results, again, looking at the NEA. Looking at one state, Iowa, I find that unions that created stronger social identities and norms were more likely to have their conservative members in particular participate in politics. So with that in mind, one thing we wanted to do on our survey was to look at how frequent unions were engaged in activities that we might think would contribute to social norms and identities. Those included things like how often they held meetings for members, rank and file members, whether they held new member orientations to create a culture when people were joining the union, sharing newsletters, and hosting social events for friends and family members and community members of unions. And you can see here that there's a lot of variation. You know, most unions members reported participating in business meetings of the rank and file, but there were a substantial number of union members who said that their local union never had new member orientations, about 25%. Newsletters were pretty common, but social events were not. About 30% of union members said that their local didn't host social events for friends, family members, or coworkers. So you can see here there's pretty really interesting variation. We also find variation across unions, too, in all of these practices. In the interest of time, I won't drill too much into those, but just note that social events are one of those in which there is some of the biggest differences between unions. And in these other areas, like member meetings and newsletters, there tended to be less variation. So we're going to come back to that finding in a moment, but to take the next phase of the presentation, I will hand things over to Alan.
Thanks, Alex. Yeah, so I'm going to talk a bit more about unions as sites of internal tension among members. So I'll just really talk through this really quickly. But overall, union members are still overwhelmingly democratic. But as Alex talked about earlier, we have enough leverage. We can actually compare union members to each other, looking at which unions they're actually in. And so I'm just going to highlight kind of the two ends of the spectrum here. But on one end, the IBT and the UFCW are much more Republican than the other unions, as you can see here. So on this plot, we have the partisanship of each union affiliation, and the x-axis is the union. And so you can just see here in the middle, the IBT, and then at the far right there, the UFCW. They're still Democratic, as a plurality of their members are still Democratic, but they're the most Republican unions here. At the other end, we have the NEA and the AFT. So the NEA is a little bit in the middle, and the AFT is a little bit on the left there, but you can see they're overwhelmingly Democratic still. And so there's a great deal of variation between union members depending on their affiliation. Okay, so here what we've done is we actually asked respondents where they placed themselves on a bunch of policies, but then we also asked them additionally where they placed their local union on those policies. What were their perceptions? And so we asked about, I'll just list them off really quickly: abortion, environmental regulation, gun control, immigration, tariffs on Mexico and Canada, the minimum wage, police, sectoral bargaining, universal health care, and the wealth tax. And so in general, there's actually a pretty close alignment between where people place themselves and where they place their local union. But what's really interesting is that there's actually more disagreement on economic issues than on these social issues. And so one potential explanation for this is that local unions don't talk about social issues as much, and so potentially these responses are effectively just guessing, and if there's like a mechanical way where they just might be projecting their own views onto the union, that's one potential explanation for this higher level of correspondence. But in general, what you'll see here is there's a gap between where more conservative members place themselves and where they think their local union is. And consistently, it seems like it's these more conservative members that think their local union is much more liberal than where they want them to be. And so thinking about this gap in how and where they place themselves and where they place their local union, we took that same plot from before and we just averaged them together to get a sense of like how far away do you think your local union is from you on all these policy issues. And so that's on the x-axis, to just walk you through it. On the left, this is saying that you think your union is too liberal for you, too left for you. On the right, it's saying that you think your union is too conservative or too right for you. And so what we have on the y-axis is just the perceptions of union representation, and we can, as you can see, if you think your union is out of step with you, you feel less represented. But the more interesting bit is then we took the same independent variable as before, right? This difference between where you place yourself and where you place your local union. And then we asked them, how likely are you to stay in your union in the next year? And what we find is folks who think that their union is too liberal, they're less likely to say they want to stay in their union versus people who think their union is too conservative. It's pretty straightforward. It seems like folks who are more left or more liberal are going to stay in their union regardless of where their local union stands. And so we think this could have implications thinking about exit, voice, and loyalty. So it seems that means more conservative members are willing to exit their union, whereas more left-wing members have to stay in the union and try to change that union. This creates a pretty different power dynamic, thinking about like, how do you relate to union officers? Union officers might have to tack a little bit to the right to try to keep some of these more conservative members happy with the union so that they don't leave. And this is especially important when we think about as the decline of unions going on more broadly, and how union officers can actually respond to threats from conservatives and Republicans. Okay, trying to march through this as fast as possible. Okay, so as Alex mentioned earlier, one potential thing that we're interested in is how social activities could actually make people feel more represented, maybe deal with some of these problems. And so what we have here on the x-axis is the same social activities that Alex talked about previously, but we average them together into a scale. And then the y-axis is how well represented they feel by their union in politics. And we see that if you have more of these social activities, you're more likely to feel represented, and this correlation survives even when we throw a bunch of controls at it. And so it seems like there could be something there, even if we're not sure if it's causal. Okay, we then broke down this result even further, asking, of these people who feel either right cross-pressured or left cross-pressured, do social activities make them feel more represented regardless of which bucket they fall into? And it seems like it actually is quite effective. There seems to be a strong correlation between having more of these social activities and feeling represented regardless of whether you think your union is too liberal or too conservative for you. So to wrap it up, just to summarize the kind of the key findings again. First, we found that there were a lot of union members who actually weren't mobilized by their local union, but of course there's still variation, as Alex showed. And there's a lot of variation between union members on a range of issues, but there are all these cross-pressured members in their relationship to their local union. And this asymmetry could be really important, right? It seems like conservative members are more willing to leave the union than more liberal or left-wing members who might have to decide to stay and try to change their union. And this could affect the way union leaders respond to politics more broadly. They might have to move to the right to try to retain some of these more conservative members. And then lastly, it seems like union socialization practices, having social activities, may help with this cross-pressure and make even conservative members feel more included and represented in politics. Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks again to the organizers, as always. It's great to be here. I'm from a UMW family, so it was great to hear the UMW already mentioned today. So for my dissertation research, I immersed myself in Targets and Walmarts in the post-industrial region of upstate New York that I'm from. I worked at both of these stores growing up. Family and friends in the region still work at places like this, etc. And I collected a couple dozen interviews in depth with the workers that I met at these stores. So retail work is one of the largest employment sectors in America today. Walmart is still the nation's largest employer, and so drawing attention to the politics of workers within this field is essential for understanding working class views in the US. This project particularly seeks to bring to light the political perspective and agency of retail workers by focusing on their widespread resistance practices, e.g. stealing, quitting, as opposed to more traditionally recognized political actions. The political stance of workers who briefly take what they can from a retail job, treat its authority with skepticism, and depart as soon as they are able to, presents a new figure of political agency that is critical to understanding the perspectives of workers in today's precarious service economy. So the constrained conditions under which a worker chooses to begin working in superstore retail can be seen, I think, in three physical elements that a worker encounters on a daily basis: the closed factory, the cop car, and the hiring poster. The area where I grew up and conducted my research is defined by many sprawling closed factories, malls, etc. Coming from the north, a commute I was used to, one first encounters the sprawling decay of the Leh cement factory, then the dilapidated industrial factories along the Kings Highway corridor, and then the sprawling grounds of a closed IBM facility that defines much of Kingston itself. As one pulls into the parking lot of the emptied-out plaza that surrounds Walmart, or better yet, the decaying and 95% closed mall that the Target is attached to, one is almost certain to see its most common daily visitor, the police. Walmarts and Targets nationwide are the location of hundreds of thousands of arrests and documented crimes per year, and obviously a large number of those arrests lead to incarcerations. Walmart is by far the single most frequent location that police are called to. Many police officers, especially in small rural areas, spend their entire shifts in the back room of Walmart. So at the end of this journey, past all these sprawling closed factories and threatening state violence, one encounters the hiring poster, always adorning the cover of a superstore. The hiring poster takes on a particular significance when considered within the landscape in which one encounters it. It's likely that you didn't see any other thriving economic activity, perhaps during your whole hour-long commute. Passing decommissioned train lines, closed factories, dead malls, and all of a sudden the hiring poster presents a way out in a landscape of limited opportunity. And in this sense, I think it's inappropriate to compare the decision to take a job at a superstore to the free choices that are available to individuals from economically stable and supportive backgrounds, imagining futures for themselves in growing economies. All of the retail workers I spoke with framed their entrance into superstore work as their last choice or their only option. More than 3/4 of these workers could be considered marginalized, often more than one way. I heard from immigrants struggling with English, folks who were disabled, elderly people, the LGBTQ community, people from especially desolate rural regions, and many workers from communities of color. And strikingly, about 1/3 of the workers I spoke with specifically did not want to work at superstores, most of all, and yet ended up working there against their will. Almost all of these workers expressed criticism about their jobs. Most workers developed their own moral economies and became more class conscious while they held these positions. The misery that a worker feels upon encountering other retail workers, especially longer-term ones, was often considered the worst part of the job. They immediately noticed that their coworkers were unhappy, that they drugged their feet, that they purposefully stole and sabotaged processes, before eventually skipping shifts and deserting their jobs altogether. Most workers pointed upwards towards endemic structural issues within the corporation to explain these behaviors. They suggested that the large corporate structure made it impossible to get to know one another. Some claimed that the corporate structure made them feel like a machine, like a number, or even like a slave in the way it paid no attention to them as individuals. Other workers focused on the greed of corporations, the ruthless pace they subjected workers to, the soaring profits of its CEOs, and the harsh punishments that they saw being meted out against their coworkers for relatively minor infractions. They also saw corporations in ways that extended beyond their own jobs, seeing corporations as the killers of local jobs and local economies, as agents of globalized supply chains that degrade local communities, and as aggressively marketing largely useless, poor quality materials. Several workers took these critiques even further, speculating about a future where they might live off the land, or a future without corporations in it. There were a few less critical narratives that only went as far as comparing retail work against concretely worse alternatives, homelessness, prison, poverty, hard physical labor, but they never quite reached a positive description of superstore work. Though retail workers have their own incisive critiques of the corporations they work for, they are very limited in their exercise of agency in the workforce. They face a highly coercive work environment in which surveillance power structures large parts of their daily lives. These stores make use of complex arrays, you can see all the security cameras here, of security cameras, barcode scanners, personal surveillance techniques, and social surveillance through a network of employees, customers, and police beyond store security itself. Many workers also face significant forms of coercive surveillance outside of the workplace in forms like workfare and probation monitoring. Though these workplaces have been structured around preventing specific forms of collective resistance, that is unions, they have also created a culture in which everyday resistance practices like foot dragging and theft are endemic. Almost all the workers I spoke with were aware of surveillance, but most were also aware of counter-surveillance practices, particularly the art of knowing how to look like you're working. It seems likely that most retail workers engage in shrink practices, corporate lingo for activities that don't benefit the corporation. In my own interview set, a large majority reported awareness of foot dragging among their coworkers, and a significant majority reported awareness of workers stealing as well. These figures echo Walmart's own statistics, which suggest that they lose over $7 billion a year to these kinds of employee resistance practices. So scholarly traditions like the New Labor History of E.P. Thompson, Herbert Gutman, the Infrapolitics of James Scott, Robin Kelly, workplace sociologists like Jan Carlson or Roland Paulson, the anarchist sabotage tradition are all relevant for making sense of these practices. For example, Carlson's definition of resistance, anything you do at work that you are not supposed to do that is directed upward, about half of the workers' narratives included such an understanding. This upwardness could be referred to many different things, a corrupt manager, Some felt they were resisting a corporation, and a few mentioned resisting the system or even capitalism specifically. Foot dragging and pilfering can also be seen as resistance even without an upwardly directed direction. James Scott reminds us that sometimes a precarious worker might not be inclined to openly resist against their only possible employer, but they may be happy to exploit small openings that allow them to gain personal dignity and exercise some level of agency. Quitting is perhaps the most common and effective form of resistance available to retail workers, and a large majority of workers quit their jobs when they are able to. And within the group I interviewed, 2/3 had dramatically improved their lives after exiting the superstore, and about half of them had developed really incisive critiques of the corporation along the way. So though these tactics don't stand a lot of chance of improving the workplace in question, they could be a part of deserting the workplace. At times, deception, evasion, and flight can be more effective tools in a long-term struggle against a powerful institution than the public discourse, confrontation, and reform that are usually seen as the only legitimate forms of political agency. When we consider the inherently unsustainable nature of the global superstore corporation in light of the quickly escalating climate catastrophe, we can argue that it might make more sense to try to desert these institutions and let them expire than to attempt to prop them up with limited reforms. According to the Invisible Committee, Scott, and others, there's a clear interrelation between the prevalence of political resistance and a broader strategy of desertion. Workers gain a sense of dignity, practice freedom through disobedience, and concretely improve their own lives through these everyday resistance practices. Though they are not engaged in the kind of reformism that many might like them to be, they are participants in a widespread desertion which could serve to empower workers and move our society away from these institutions. So, leaving aside social media research that I conducted more recently for this project, I largely did this research in 2019, 2020, and here in 2025, I find myself returning to the context in which I originally conceived this project in 2017. After the first election of Donald Trump the previous November, I heard quite a lot of shock and confusion around New York City. Pollsters had predicted a decisive Clinton win with a 90+ margin of certainty. Meanwhile, back where I was from, the area around Kingston narrowly broke for Clinton, but all of the surrounding counties on our side of the Hudson went firmly for Trump. Anyone who had been driving along the rural highways and mountain roads of this area in the preceding years wouldn't have been surprised, given the ubiquity of Trump signs and handmade tributes. The elaborate pro-Trump messages painted on the sides of barns and tractors were particularly striking. And it occurred to me there was something that wasn't being seen here. And unfortunately, these same media commentators settled on J.D. Vance's hillbilly elegy as the explanation. Like my own study, Vance wrote about an economically depressed post-industrial rural area that he had spent some time growing up in. But Vance did not display much compassion for his people, nor did he attempt to honestly understand their complex histories and culture. Instead, he self-aggrandized himself and portrayed his community in demeaning welfare queen tropes of conservative rhetoric. Many Appalachians who are far more immersed in the actual Appalachian community have since rejected these simplistic tropes, some of these books here. However, in certain passages, the declining rural communities he's focused on did sound similar to the people in my own area. Considering his own people, Vance wrote, "We choose not to work when we should be looking for jobs. Sometimes we'll get a job, but it won't last. We'll get fired for tardiness, or for stealing merchandise and selling it on eBay, or for having a customer complain about the smell of alcohol on our breath, or taking 5 30-minute restroom breaks." Vance had no interest in understanding why these workers behaved this way, since, his goals were otherwise. But he inadvertently echoes this study's claim that practices like theft, absenteeism, and cultural values at odds with capitalist work discipline have become quite endemic in contemporary working-class rural communities. In my area, far from Vance's fantasy land, these practices point towards workers who question the low-quality jobs at massive global corporations that are available to them, and question the system that has put them in such a constrained place. It points towards workers who are longing for an alternative to hierarchy and consumerism, and who are evidently ready to embrace guerrilla direct actions in this pursuit. For those of us to seek to truly understand and assist these workers, we would do well to keep these actions and beliefs as framing priorities.
Thank you. Okay, we have about 40 minutes for your questions and for discussion. Thank you for the 3 very provocative presentations. And Casey is collecting written questions, and we can alternate between those and people who just prefer to speak their questions spontaneously. So why don't we start with one of those, which I think Angela can kick us off.
Thanks so much. It was a great panel.
Is there a mic for Angela somewhere? Oh, we can just steal one of these, yeah. Sorry, it's being recorded, so it'd be good to use the mic.
Thanks so much for the great panel. On the survey of research, I wanted to know if you'd seen the work of Greg Lyons. I was surprised to see some of his work recently, combined work with others. I was surprised to hear that so many Republicans actually support unions. And it seems like it could be relevant for your work. The other thing is, you talked about the potential for union members leaving, but actually the data I've seen is that there's fairly high union satisfaction. I mean, it's extraordinarily high, like 90%. And so it doesn't seem like that many union members actually leave, and I wondered if you'd seen that data and whether, it could actually be relevant for the conclusions you're reaching. And then on the shorter work week, the information from a number of places that have recently, I'm sure you've seen that. It's so interesting, right? That the 4-hour or the 4-day work week doesn't actually affect productivity for the week at all. I know Iceland and a number of other countries. But anyway, thank you all for the panels. They were excellent. The presentations were great.
Thanks, Angela. Alec, do you two want to respond first, and then Wes?
Yeah,
Hopefully
sure.
that works. Good.
Yeah. I didn't know about that work, but thanks for sharing it. I'll look it up. But yeah, on this point of high satisfaction, I mean, one potential story that I could think of is that union leaders know that this is a potential threat, and so then they immediately deal with it and retain high satisfaction, and so then we don't actually lose members. I mean, I want to say in equilibrium because of my training, but like in the real world, that they know that this is a threat, and so they deal with it immediately. But Alex, do you want to add anything?
No, it's just appreciate the suggestion to think about these dynamics and how they may play out. So thank you.
Thanks for drawing attention to the pilot studies. Certainly one of the things that informs our work a lot. What we've seen recently is that, at least in the U.S. context, so the lion's share of the pilots happen one of 2 ways. Either self-identifying employers will sign up to participate, or there will be some sort of state forcing function. Writ large, we've reached a sort of carrying capacity, at least in the US context, around the former. And so the way that I initially came to this issue is we had reached a point where working with employers had sort of stopped being effective. As with, I think, almost any issue in the workplace, to operate at scale in a way that benefits workers, it has to be driven by labor first. And so I think one of the interesting aspects of these pilot studies is how we then translate to a wider sort of transformative work. And I think the answer to that is labor organizing. So thanks for drawing attention to that.
Great. I want to read one of the questions from here, and then we'll come to you. This is from Pam Whitefield, who's right here. for Alex and Alan, to what extent do you think your findings would change if you accounted for the building trades in your data? Or maybe you did, but I don't think you showed us any findings from them. And the second question she had is whether, to what extent or what role did COVID, the pandemic, have on your findings, if any?
Yeah, such great questions. So the building trades are included in the larger sample, and we've separately, together with the great folks at the Center for Labor and a Just Economy, actually earlier this week, put out a larger report that I encourage folks to check out if they're interested, that includes more breakouts of some of these questions on partisanship and ideology of members by different sectors, including in construction, that drills into those questions. We unfortunately didn't have enough observations to be able to dig into individual building trades unions, but I think it would be really interesting because you think about internal organization and attachment of workers to the union.
That identity and culture thing is there, and so to the extent that there's this other element that plays out, and so I wonder if it would change your findings in any way. Can you use a mic? Oh. Do you want to just reiterate what
Or yes, so emphasizing the building trades as being a site where there are a lot of these practices that build union identity in a way that could keep people in the union even if they have conflicts over individual positions, which I think is exactly right. Maybe the other thing to say, and these are all great suggestions as we continue with the analysis, is I think it's interesting to think about context where the threat of departure may be more or less salient, and obviously one important dimension is right to work status or agency fees that may create more of an opportunity for folks to threaten to leave the union if they disagree.
Did you want to speak to the COVID thing too? Or
Yeah. So the survey was from 2024, but so it wasn't during the COVID period. But I don't think we have anything specifically on how unions adapted to COVID, but recognize it was a very different context.
suggest to you that that it might be a blip, because I think that the practices that happened in this period and prior to it in the political work was different than years before and might be different from years. And that's just from on the ground knowing, a lot of sitting around with carpenters who said, our political program was crap last year, and that's mostly because of the pandemic. So I think that really needs to be taken into account in terms of a longer view of this.
That's really helpful. Thank you.
Okay, let's go to Anu, who's right here, and
then I know we have some hands raised in the back as well.
there's lots of hands, but I think she was first. Yeah.
Hiya, this was really great. I have two questions. First one is for this survey. So I used to be a union researcher at 1199 SEIU.
Is that working? Can people hear you?
Can you hear me? Okay. And I remember talking to members who were frustrated at the timing of outreach for social activities, and they would be like, oh, the union only reaches out when there's like budget concerns or elections. And so I'm curious if you could or have taken into account like the frequency of social outreach and whether that has any impact on people's feelings of alignment. And then my second question is for Noah. So the conditions you mentioned for people being likely to join box stores also made me think of upstate New York and prison towns. And I'm curious who chooses to join the prison workforce, like COs, et cetera, versus who's in the box stores, and how people view like their longevity in the workforce.
Great.
Okay. Yeah, the number of these towns are places where a lot of people work in prisons, and I think just from like experience growing up in the region, a lot of it has to do with social connections. If the norm amongst people is working in big box stores, you work in big box stores. If you already have an uncle and a grandpa who work at the prison, you're more likely to work there. But you're absolutely right. It is the same sort of regions, the same sort of bleak economic opportunities that kind of lead to both sort of spheres. The other thing I would say is that people with little to no social connection, people that are newer to the region, for example, are much more likely to move into something like big box work because it's what's available. It's so obviously available because you go there as a customer, and so it can kind of draw in people who have no other connection that would send them in any particular direction.
But don't the prison jobs pay better, even though they have their own issues? Yeah.
Yes.
So great question about whether or not unions are engaged in these one-off or very sporadic political requests, or whether it's a more organic process. And actually, that was some great feedback we got on our results from Mike Podhorzer earlier in this week, was that we may be missing out on some of the more organic types of communication that happen in unions, and we're more capturing these sporadic requests that the unions may be making of their members. So it's definitely something that's on our mind. But Alan, I don't know if there's more.
No, that's exactly right. I mean, we do try to ask about frequency in the survey, and we get some variation there. But I think, yeah, that's right. I mean, we can't capture like all the ways that this is happening. Like, you know, as you mentioned, like if there's like a problem and then you ask, like we're not gonna pick up that exact thing, or like if they're just more regularly doing it. So yeah, I think that's a great thing to look into.
Can we go to, is it Andres?
Yeah, thank you so much for the fascinating papers. They resonated a lot with the work that we are doing in Leipzig in the German context, also doing representative surveys and ethnographies. So I got a couple of questions, trying to make it short. Wes, I was wondering, do you see it as kind of a realistic possibility right now to unify people behind these demands of working hours, and what would be the leverage? As I was thinking about the German Metal Workers Union, which would be correspondent to the UAW maybe, and which were strongly pushing for shorter working hours before the crisis, but right now it's all defensive struggles against plant closures, against layoffs, and this time so in the core industries of automotive and steel. So how is that in the USA right now? Then Alex and Alan, I was wondering, as you kind of investigated the socializing effects of unions, kind of like civil society organizations, have you also investigated effects of socialization in the workplace? Like we, because we in Leipzig, we also found that union members and non-members do not differ regarding their political attitudes, regarding far-right attitudes. But they, what makes a difference was, or what made a difference in our service was workers' feeling of democratic efficacy at the workplace, which was really shaped by union politics. So do union politics in the workplace translate to feelings of empowerment, of efficacy, which made people lesser, or which caused lesser support for far-right attitudes, actually? And then, Noah, I was wondering, as you kind of made the case for desertion and these everyday practices of resistance, but I have this kind of a critical question maybe. Did you see any types of collectivity or solidarity arise from these practices? Like, have people been exchanging about these ways of stealing and stuff, or did it all restrain to an individual level? Yeah.
Great. Why don't we just walk our way across? Yeah.
Thank you for that question. Is this on? There we go. Thank you for that question. I think feasibility is sort of the primary objection that we get as a first question when we talk to workers or employers about shorter hours. I think the answer to the particular framing that you've offered is that when you talk to rank and file workers, one of their core dissatisfactions with their unions, almost as a rule, is the lack of ambition that their locals have with respect to organizing. And part of why we see shorter hours is one of the answers to greater union participation in the first place, and thus greater democracy within the workplace, is that it is perhaps the most ambitious demand that we can offer at this moment, right? One of the ways that we really frame this work is that control is the hardest thing to wrest from the boss. Control issues are much more difficult to bargain for than our workplace condition issues. And that's because they want as much control as they can have. And there's no place where they have less control than when you are not on the job. And so this is sort of the chief control issue in that way. As a result, it's a hard thing to bargain for, but it is also the thing that is most likely to mobilize the sort of disaffected portion of the workplace. I think it has significant opportunity to increase union membership. John's experience with the Times Tech Guild was that there were people that had no interest in union membership at all until 4-day was mentioned as an issue, at which time it became much more compelling for those workers. And then the last thing that I want to say about feasibility that I think is really relevant is that we talk a lot within the movement about the possibility of this within the tech field, specifically because tech workers have shown the greatest interest. But I think there's a really interesting historical analog that tells a better story of the broader, more expansive work here, which is that when the Times was first fighting for shorter hours, the way that the News Guild, so the journalist portion of the Times, got a 35-hour week was first by the typesetters and the printers bargaining for 28-hour, 7-hour days. These are the current printers and typesetters, right? The people that are printing the news now are the digital workers. And there's, I think, a frequent refrain within the labor movement about sort of privileged workers fighting for things that other workers don't have availability to. I think the way to reframe that within the context of shorter hours as relates to feasibility is that you have to win it in the easiest places first as a way of expanding to those other places. The number of unions and harder shops that have asked for examples of shops that have won this is practically infinite. And so I think that the way that we think about it is not in terms of prioritizing privileged workers over non-privileged workers. We have no interest in doing that, but rather we need to see wins early. And so I think that we do that where there's the most interest.
Yeah, I mean, this is not a study that I've done, but Betsy Pollock and Sherry Wu have this interesting paper where they ran this large experiment randomizing participatory meetings, and they do actually find, well, I'll just read the relevant part of the abstract. Participatory meetings led workers to be less authoritarian and more critical about societal authority and justice, and to be more willing to participate in political, social, and familial decision making. So yeah, I think that's totally possible. It just might require that to get an effect of being in a union. Unions just have to do that more on average. But yeah, at least in my work, it seems like there isn't at least an average effect. But yeah, Alex, do you want to add anything?
I mean, no, just that I think this is a super interesting finding, and we have data in the survey that asks about participatory practices in union democracy. And I think a question that we're curious to look into is whether that spills over into other forms of politics. Maybe the other thing to mention is, in the US context, a really salient factor of the workplace is, although there's been a lot of sorting with Democrats becoming more likely to work in companies and workplaces with more Democrats and Republicans with more co-partisans as well, the workplace is still one of the places that is not primarily sorted along these lines, unlike, for instance, institutions of higher education or faith groups. And so I think there is the possibility not just for more participatory interactions, but also cross-cutting interactions between people who may have different political views that itself also has important spillovers for how people think about conflict and the political process.
Yeah, I think that developing class consciousness is one of the most encouraging things I see about these trends. You see it, first of all, in cooperation in the workplace, people helping each other to get away with time theft or the theft of merchandise. You may see moral panics in conservative media about skyrocketing organized retail theft, for example. It's a real thing, and it's certainly underrepresented, if anything. Many of these people became kind of local community anti-corporate activists after exiting the superstore, where they would kind of encourage every single person that would listen to them to never go to Walmart. It's the worst place ever, that sort of thing. And a big part of this project, which I didn't really touch on today, but is a lot of in the book, after 2020, I turned a lot towards social media. I particularly recommend the Reddit communities of R Walmart, R Target, and R Anti-Work. If you want to see a running hidden transcript of the building class consciousness that's engendered by these kind of activities. Quit Talks on TikTok, also a great place to kind of look for this sort of thing.
Fascinating. Okay, I'm going to read one question from here and then Patricia. This is a question from Lynn Turner, who's right there. It's for Wes. Shorter hours is a great demand. She writes, but given... I can't quite read all of this, but how do you deal with that demand to encompass non-employees, independent contractors or part-timers, so that it doesn't become multiple 30-hour jobs? And also, how about the problem of how benefits are often tied to how many hours you work?
The excellent question. there are two primary ways that you organize to avoid those two issues. The first is that the benefits issue hinges almost entirely on state and federal legislation. That's part of why we didn't see a nationwide adoption of the 40-hour week until the FLSA was passed, and certainly why that is sort of the controlling function for the federal 32-hour week now, is that you need a hook. You need some sort of enforcement mechanism to say benefits still cash if you're at 32 hours instead. And so there is a sort of legislative function that has to play a part there. But I also think that we don't want to, hang all of our hopes on the state. And so one of the ways that you do that is that in your demands while you're bargaining, you just ensure that that's part of the puzzle here. I think that the contractor question is much more difficult. I think the hours issue is a great example of how organizing alongside contractors just needs to be a part and parcel of the way that shops are organizing today. Part-time work, the way that it's handled is basically you are bargaining for a wage increase that incorporates whatever. So if you've got a 40-hour hourly employee, their wages now reflect 32 hours at the same rate, and that wage increase would impact part-time workers in the same way. So it would, lift all boats in that sense. But I think the contractor worker issue is more difficult, and basically the only way to get there is to ensure that you're working in solidarity with contractors to make sure that their voices are heard on this issue, and that they're shaping what it means to have shorter hours or less work for themselves.
Thank you. Patricia?
Yeah, this is a question for Alex and Alan. Looking at the data and sort of having been a former political director for several unions, I want to understand how you are defining political engagement and political education across unions, because I find that sometimes we confuse political education with electoral mobilization and electoral outreach. And that matters because, coming back from like the Union Act 2 that was spent a lot of time organizing in the South, and you wanted to win a campaign in the South, even in the 90s, in the 80s and 90s, you have to engage in political education, which was like popular education, what's happening, who's the boss, who's the opposition, who this for years before you can get black and white workers to work together. So what I want to ask you is, in your analysis of the data, in your presentation of the data to the unions, are we actually equalizing political mobilization, electoral mobilization that unions spend a lot of their resources on lately, and differentiating between what we really need to do, which is political education, so workers understand the commonality of the fight. So when elections come, they actually can make the right choices. So I think language matters. And as you present this, it seems like we're divided, we never can get there. But we're actually not doing political education. What we're doing is electoralizing our members, and then we're dividing them. So how do we change that narrative? And is that part of your analysis?
Really appreciate that comment and suggestion, which is to say it's both a way to talk about this research, but also how to do measurement better, and separating out as you have electoral mobilization from political education, I think is really important. And we're interested in both. The results that we presented today are very much electoral mobilization, asks in 2024 around discrete acts to support campaigns or candidates in that particular election cycle. But I think, as you note, we really can't take these ideologies or positions of workers as fixed, that unions that are investing in that kind of political education can actually shape that worldview. That's a lot harder for us to measure, not least of all in a one-off survey where you don't get to track people over time and see how their beliefs change. That's something Alan has looked into in some of his work. But I think you're exactly right that we need to be measuring and thinking about these activities separately, and need to think about good ways of tracking it, especially in a representative way. But Alan, I know you've thought a lot about these issues too. I don't know if you want to add more.
No, I think that's a great point. I mean, yeah, we try to do this a little bit. We ask about more broadly, like were they asked to attend political events or share political information? But I think that's right. I mean, most of the survey is like mostly focused on, I think, elections, just because that was the most salient bit. But yeah, I think that's something we should be attentive to in the future. Thanks.
You can get in line, but next is Bob in the back, but we'll get to you. We have plenty of time still.
Bob Master, retired political director for the CWA in the Northeast, and just wanted to thank everybody for the presentations. My question is actually very much complementary to Patricia's question, but before I ask it, I do want to say that I think that the results of the survey that Alex and Alan did very much conforms with our experience in terms of members' attitude towards the union based on their politics, right? And so even though I would say most CWA members don't have the option of actually quitting the union because they're in union shops or in agency shops, certainly their level of satisfaction or approval of what the union's activities are is very much shaped by whether or not they are Republican identified, Trump identified, et cetera. And, whereas overall, let's say 2/3 of our members or 70% of our members think highly of the union, those Republican Trumpy members are way, way more negative, even though probably majority of them like the union, but still much, much lower. But my question is, you went very quickly through the issue of social activities as a shaping factor in people's politics and attitudes towards the union. And I don't know if I saw it exactly right, but you kind of lumped together union meetings and other kinds of social activities. And in sort of keeping with what Patricia was asking, I would want a more fine-grained breakdown of that, because I sort of feel like a regular union meeting is not a social activity, right? It's a reflection of a participatory organization where members actually have input into the life of the organization. And CWA has a lot of small locals, many of them way too small, but they have a lot of small locals, and they have regular meetings, usually every month except in the summer. People, local officers are really accountable, and I think that's one variation of how unions function that affects people's political attitudes. Social activities are also pretty common in the CWA, golf tournaments, softball tournaments, things like that, but it seems different when you kind of lump them together as social activities. So I was just, maybe I didn't see the distinctions, but if you could dig in on that a little bit, that would be helpful.
Yes, great question, and appreciate hearing also how these results jibe with your own experience, having spent a lot of time thinking about the political representation of CWA members and political education within CWA as well. So just to share a little bit more about the socialization piece, so in other work I mentioned that I've done with the NEA, particularly their affiliates in Iowa, I found that investment in socialization, including what happens at new member orientations, but also the kinds of social events that you were mentioning, charity events, softball tournaments, raffles, volunteering in the local community, that all of that seemed to contribute to a broader sense of a norm of participation for some locals, that in some locals, what it meant to be a good member was to show up to the social events, was to show up to the business meetings, and was to participate in politics when you were asked to, say, canvass for a school board race or a state legislative race, and that it all fit together into a coherent identity. And so that's a little bit of what we were trying to pick up, and why we had asked about a range of these different activities that all underlie whether or not someone is coming into regular contact with other union members and leaders, and information is being conveyed and potentially reinforced through an identity. But I totally take your point that there are some substantive differences between these different activities, and it's worth digging into as we proceed with this analysis for sure. Thank you. And Alan?
No, I thought that was totally right. Yeah, and we can even check just excluding member meetings, just see if the results still hold. I think that's very simple to do and something we're happy to do. Thanks.
Great. And let's go to Mark now, which sounds like it's on the same general topic.
I guess to Bob's list of social activities, I'd add ethnic celebrations of various kinds. But my question is whether you consider political education a social activity.
That's a good question. I think people in the audience might be in a better position to answer than us. I mean, I have looked at a couple of political education programs, and I think there's a lot of variation, as I suspect maybe people in the room are better situated to describe, whether it's a chance to get release time to, to spend time with your coworkers, or actually, combine with fun social activities too, or, a chance to invest in building new skills. But actually, I'd be curious what folks in the audience think about that.
Is this on that topic, Jeff?
This is a follow-up to this conversation here, and then a separate question. In addition to union practices that might influence membership engagement or loyalty to the union, participation in political activities, I think it would be useful to add to that both the structure of the work that they do and the culture associated with that work. I think that there's likely to be real variations based on the work that people do. If you look, just taking a look for a moment at the building trades, the reality of a building trades union member's employment experience is that they work for multiple employers over the course of their work lives, or even over the course of a year, and generally feel a much closer affinity to their local union than they do to an employer. That's both a question about the structure of the work, and then also a culture that's kind of associated with it. So I just think that's like another cut on the same question, is trying to differentiate both union practices, but also the structure of the sector of the economy and the work culture associated with it. And some of those connect to union practices, like that in the building trades, those union members are dependent on their local union for employment. And so that also may influence their attachment or affinity to the union. Separate from that is just on to Wes on this shorter work week. You kind of drew a connection between a shorter work week struggle and internal union democracy. I wonder if you might want to more explicitly tie it to a struggle for democracy in the external environment. And your point about the 8-hour day, I mean, the chance of the 8-hour day movement, where 8 hours for work, 8 hours for rest, 8 hours for what we will. And the what we will time, I think, was a really important piece of that movement, where workers wanted to have libraries and debating societies and the time to develop themselves as citizens active in the democracy. So I wonder if that might be another way to kind of reframe the demand for a shorter work week and connect it explicitly to a fight to protect and expand democracy.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for that. That was one of the things that actually was just cut for time, is that the core belief behind working less is that it provides this opportunity for generative activity in the rest of our lives. The belief that workers will use that time to make a better world because they will have it is absolutely a part of the picture. So thank you for highlighting that. The other thing that I didn't get a chance to mention that I think is really relevant here is that a number of folks have drawn connections between workplace democracy and greater democracy elsewhere, because the workplace is a site of authoritarianism itself. I think Elizabeth Anderson might be one of the most notable ones here, which is that there is no place where we are less in control, where we are more dictated to, where we are more controlled in our every movement than the workplace. And the function of that is that the workplace is a place where we are trained to act without thinking. And to bucket that is to provide a smaller, more local opportunity to bucket authoritarianism writ large. So it's absolutely the case that the extra time, to your point about the 8-hour chant, is indicative of building a better world, not just because of the opportunities for politics and organizing, but the opportunities for art and writing and family and medicine, all of the things that are more difficult because of how often and how long we work, but also because the political activity that happens within the workplace is in fact a mirror to the political activity that can happen elsewhere.
Do you guys want to speak to the sectoral issue? Maybe could we roll into that, public versus private sector maybe?
Yeah, I mean, I think all great suggestions, and thinking about the structure of work is, I think, really, really vital here. And I refer back to the great book by Lainey Newman and Theda Scotchpole that has a paired comparison between steel workers and I think it's electricians in Western Pennsylvania, and talking about how in some cases some locals that of the electricians were unable to keep the same kind of social identity because they did not invest in, for instance, means of keeping members in touch with each other, despite the fact that others had. So I think there's a lot of variation even within that, of the extent to which, for instance, newsletters, they really point out, were an important way that members felt like they were staying in touch with one another and had a common union identity. And I think public versus private sector matters as well, especially for thinking about the kind of political education and then ultimately mobilization requests that you're going to get. You know, for the teachers, for instance, it's local school board races, state legislative races, and that's on a whole different calendar than unions that are focused on federal elections.
I want to call on myself with another question for Noah, which is this. I just wanted to know more about the demographic characteristics of the workers in those superstores. Are they mostly young? What's the racial and gender makeup, et cetera? And I guess, related to that, do you see any, and the other big, well, I already said about young, is there variation in behavior and attitudes related to those variations in demography?
My sample size wasn't huge here, but no, it was maybe what was most notable was that I didn't see any trends like that. Amongst the most critical retail workers, you had, young women of color and old white men. And similarly, amongst the least critical workers, you saw a similar demographic spread. They're certainly all working class and rural. They have those elements in common. But other than that, I really didn't pick up trends related to other demographic categories.
I can't remember the name of it, but there's a recent novel about a store in that region. Do you know what I'm talking about? Oh, okay. I'll talk to you about it later. I'll dig it up. I just can't recall. Does anybody remember offhand? It's about upstate New York at what looks like a Target or something. One of the themes in there, though, that I think I listened to the audiobook or something, that is the issue of the opportunities for moving up, which has been a big issue in the Amazon organizing and all that. And so I don't know if you encountered that issue or the frustration about the lack of such opportunities, really more than. But anyway, was that something that turned up in your research? What?
Most people did think it to be very dead end, no opportunity to move up. I did speak with managers, which was interesting. They were some of the most kind of deep critiques of the corporation. I spoke with a number of managers who abruptly deserted in the middle of a workday with no prospect for what they were going to do next, because managers are, the demands placed on them are so extreme once they hit that salary level that in many ways they considered their jobs to get much worse. And they also had to deal with all these other things that I'm talking about. They were constantly firing workers for petty thefts and stuff like this, which they fundamentally didn't believe in, having been those workers recently. So beyond the fact that people didn't see there was an opportunity for advancement, a lot of people thought that advancement in these corporations was specifically undesirable, which I guess has something to do with why people choose exit.
Interesting. Okay, thank you. I think we're basically at time. I have a couple housekeeping announcements in a minute, but first, please join me in thanking our presenters. So first, I just want to tell you that just like if you were here yesterday, the routine lunch will be outside here shortly, and the afternoon, and then there's a community meeting in this room, moderated by Alex Hahn of In These Times and Margarita Hernandez of the Grassroots Power Project. So the idea is to grab your lunch and come back. And the afternoon sessions will start at 12:45. They're in your program. The only other thing I want to mention is on the smaller programs, or actually maybe on all of them, there's a QR code, and we'd love it if you would scan that and offer an evaluation of your experience at the conference. And before we close, Mark Kagan has a quick announcement.
You heard Ruth start by talking about the brutality against Palestine protesters yesterday at Brooklyn College, and also about the ICE issues at CUNY. If you want to give the CUNY Board of Trustees a piece of your mind. They're having a public hearing on Monday at 4 p.m. But to do that, you must email hearing, no S, hearing at cuny.edu before 12 noon today, and just say you want to register as a speaker, and that puts you on the list, and then you can speak. I would expect there'll be some kind of protest as well, that it will not just be, you know, speaking but acting as well. Thank you.
Great, thanks.
So you have a half an hour to do that. Sorry, thank you. LaGuardia Community College.